Yeah, I mean, I think some people who just, they don't like the whole genre of popular music, and then, they just listen to classical music or just listen to, jazz or whatever, then I sort of get it. But I think if you like popular music and you've no appreciation of the Beatles, I am slightly suspect of that.
I know that you're, like myself, are a big Beach Boys fan, and it's been nice seeing them. I think they've been having a bit of a renaissance over the past, decade or two.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, of course, there's now kind of sad news about Brian being diagnosed with dementia. But I do think the people, because I know some people are quite close to him, and it feels like the people around him really do have his best interests at heart, these days, which of course wasn't always the way. So, I mean, that's good.
Yeah, he also lost his wife recently, which, I'll say my grandfather, after my grandmother went, and his dementia just really spiked. There's something about that. Those two things are very much connected.
Oh yeah, I think a shock. It's like a lot of old people will have a fall that seems quite an insignificant fall, but after that, or after if they've been working long after, their supposed retiral date, and then they suddenly stop, all these things can trigger it. I met Brian and Melinda together in 1996, and they were both really delightful. That was before he'd started, doing gigs again and stuff.
I don't know. At that point, was he still in the throes of all of the Eugene Landy stuff? It must have been a little bit after that.
No, it was after that, because that was, I guess Melinda was part of the thing that ended up rescuing him from the kind of clutches of Landy. So, yeah, he was in a much better place than David Leaf, although never been his official manager. He's written about Brian a lot, and he's a good friend. David kind of set up the opportunity for us to go down to London to meet him and film a little interview with him. And as I say, it was around about the time that he was still doing some work with Don Was, but he was removed from, or Landy was removed from Brian's life, which was a great thing. Anyway, sorry for that.
A week or two ago, had Don Was on the show, and he is. I think he's one of those people. People know Was Not Was, but he's one of those people who doesn't get credit for being this through line between so much, late 20th century, early 21st century music.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of guys like that who they're not really stars as such, but they do so many things, and as you say, are involved in so many projects. But they tend to almost be invisible figures.
One of the things I appreciate about him specifically is kind of the breadth of the music that he plays. He is and for a long time has been the president of Blue Note Records in New York, and he's also in a band with Bob Weir, which.
And he did some recordings with Brian Wilson. So, I mean, just from those.
And Dylan, how did you find Brian to be at that point?
He was in really good form. I mean, I think I spoke to him a couple of times after it and met him a couple of other times. But he was with Melinda, and we filmed the two of them together. And there was a real warmth between the two of them. I would say Brian was... he was always going to be Brian. It was never going to be like having a chat with someone who wasn't damaged in some sort of way. But he was really, really friendly. And, we were talking about little details about specific tracks, and he was just remembering them all. There wasn't any sort of, he didn't know what we were talking about, or he couldn't remember sessions and things. Anything we asked him about, he knew about. And I'm a massive fan of the Beach Boys' Love You, which is my favourite Beach Boys album. But it's like, it's one that definitely splits the vote. And without us prompting him at all, he said that was his favourite Beach Boys album, which of course I was delighted by. My friend David Scott, who I was doing the interview with, it's his favourite as well. I mean, a lot of people like Alex Chilton, who we worked with, and we did a Brian Wilson tribute album. Alex straight away was, well, I'm doing something off Love You because I know how to play every track in that album because it's my favourite. And Carol Wilson taught Alex Chilton to play guitar. The Box Tops toured with the Beach Boys as a support act, and Carol taught him how to play guitar.
Because he was like 15 in the Box Tops, right?
Yeah, I mean, by this point, I think he would have been a little bit older, because I think this was 69, because after the tour, Alex went back to Dennis's ranch, and could you guess who was staying at Dennis's ranch at that point?
I have the way your face lit up. I have an idea who it might be.
Yeah,
not,
so the Manson family,
not a reputable figure. Yeah,
no, and yeah, so Alex, it was interesting, that whole tour. It taught him guitar, and he also ended up meeting Charles Manson.
So Alex Chilton met Charles Manson at Dennis Wilson's ranch.
Yeah. And he got sent for the shopping one day, and I told the story that he got sent for the shopping, and it was quite a walk to the store. He didn't drive. Maybe he did later, I'm not sure, but he didn't drive that time, so he had a long walk, and he got given a list. And when he arrived back at the house, one of the Manson family stopped at the door and said, "We want to check you got everything." And he'd forgotten the milk. And they said to him, "Oh, you've forgotten the milk. You need to go back and get it." And Alex is, he was a sort of fiery guy in a lot of ways. And a lot of people, I think, if he'd said to him, he would have went, "Get lost, I'm not walking another 8 miles to get my milk." But he was like, "I thought it was a good idea. I don't know why. I just thought it was a good idea." So I walked back and I got the milk.
I had my inkling, and now it's confirmed, but you are a font of music trivia. And I say this because one of the things that I find useful before speaking with somebody is to go through and look through the recent social media activity, just to see what they've been thinking about and doing lately. And I had no idea. This is just every once in a while you'll find something out about something and it will just completely recontextualize it. I didn't know that Blank Generation in a pretty profound way was almost a cover.
Yeah, I mean, musically it's very, very similar, and it made me like Blank Generation better when I figured that out, because I thought, well, that's so clever. That's such a great idea, taking this thing, this other piece about the Beat Generation, and turning it into the Blank Generation. And as I say, I think I'm a big fan of Rod McEwen, who wrote the Beat Generation, and I think for some people, again, he's a bit like the Beach Boys' Love You. He's a bit of a kind of a figure that some people would just laugh at and dismiss.
Polarizing, perhaps?
Yeah, polarizing. But I think he did a lot of really great things. And, one of the other things I was mentioning was, well, he was the first person commissioned to write a whole album for Frank Sinatra. And I loved his response to writing that album. About maybe 40% of that album's spoken word. So you think, you've been the first songwriter commissioned to write an album for many people would regard the greatest singer of that era, and you presented an album that's partly spoken, about 40% spoken word. That's quite far out. And he made in 1977, I think it was, he made a gay disco album, which has got a pretty out there sleeve. He was a radical and a maverick.
It's a male porn actor with a fistful of vegetable shortening.
Yeah.
Which, the implications, I assume, are pretty clear for people.
Yeah. And I'm not going to repeat the title because the imagery it would create alongside the can of the product is quite full on. But so I think that's very often the way that people, to me, who are really interesting artists, are the sort of people that people could laugh at. And I think that's, I think that's happened all through I guess, the history of art and music. I remember Norman Blake more famously of Teenage Fan Club, who
also has been on the show.
Yeah, and he's been part of BMX Bandits family for a long, long time, and he's like one of my oldest friends. He was once interviewed and said, "What do you need to be in the BMX Bandits?" And he says, "You need to be not frightened of ridicule." And I think he's right, you know.
What does that mean to you?
I think it means, well, I don't think we've ever played safe. And I think, yeah, I'm maybe a bit of a polarising figure for some people. Sometimes I think it's with people who don't actually even know BMX Bandits music. They just sort of have an idea about me, or they've maybe seen me a bit, and they think, oh yeah, he's just a kind of funny guy, you know, kind of quirky guy. We won't even bother listening to the work because we know what he's all about. And yeah, I was always the sort of guy, you know, in our hometown, we kind of came from a pretty rough, ex-industrial kind of background. The town where we grew up, hard drinking sort of town. And, you know, people would generally, through my teens and past that, a lot of people would be shouting abuse at me and laughing at me. But I never actually, the arrogance of youth, I actually I found that empowering. I quite liked, you know, so if it was like, if I caused outrage when I walked by a certain pub, you know, a bar, I don't know if the term pub is in common usage, I guess it's not. Yeah, so if you walk by a bar or a pub in Bellshill and people are shouting abuse at you because of the way you look or you don't kind of fit in, most people maybe the next day would go a different route or something. But the arrogance of youth would make me make sure I was wearing something much more outrageous the next day. So if they were annoyed on day one, you know, the next day I'd go by maybe wearing a deer stalker and smoking a Sherlock Holmes pipe, you know, or something just to... So I think there's an aspect of that in the makeup and the DNA of BMX Bandits. We don't deliberately go out of our way to annoy people, but if people are annoyed at us, we're not going to calm it down for you.
It's really interesting to hear you say all this because, you know, from my point of view and for as long as I've known about the band, I would never have thought to call you polarizing.
Well, in the early shows we used to do, and I think this was the same for people like Orange Juice and things. I think it was just the sort of time we came out. We don't get this now, but, you know, people would throw glasses, you know, at us and, like, be really abusive. And quite a few times, if we played in Aberdeen, which is like an oil city in the north of Scotland, we quite often would have to get the police to come and escort us out the building because the audience would be so outraged. But, you know, a percentage of the audience would love us. Vaseline's had that thing as well. A percentage of the audience would love us, but a big percentage of the audience wanted to kill us. And it's not so much like that. I think it's just we didn't present a kind of the image of the macho, hedonistic, kind of poisonous kind of masculinity, kind of rock star thing.
Yeah.
And around about that time in the 1980s, some people still found that a kind of problem, you know.
I have the perception that a lot of sort of the early, like, punk bands, for instance, probably ran afoul of a lot of people. So it's a little surprising to hear that, you know, coming after that kind of countercultural movement, that people were still that closed off.
A lot of those people shouting abuse and things were actually, ironically, people who weren't just, it was older kind of rock fans, but it was definitely people who'd been kind of in the punk rock wars in some sort of way. But I guess BMX Bandits and Orange Juice weren't presenting a kind of aggressive male thing that some punk bands like the Sex Pistols sort of did.
I was just talking to somebody about this the other day because John Lydon is also a button pusher, but in a very different way than you are.
Yeah, and he got, you know, he would get a kicking occasionally because of that. And I mean, I generally didn't. I managed to avoid getting beat up on most occasions, but it was a couple of times where, you know, someone hit me over the head with a metal bar because...
His idea of pushing buttons is, you know, embracing, like, fascism, which is a different approach. I suspect that for you, maybe a lot of it came down to, I don't know, were you called, were there like gay slurs tossed about? Was it that kind of thing?
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely part of it. I mean, there's a track on the new BMX Bandits album, which actually addressed all this. It's called My Name is Douglas. In brackets, don't listen to what they say. And the track is sort of like a dramatization of a little scene put to a kind of electronic musical theme where various Calvin Johnson from Be Happening and Jughead from Swell Maps are playing kind of naysayers, kind of saying, who is that weirdo? Who is that,
Calvin Johnson of all people.
I know. Well, I wanted the people on it doing those parts to actually be people like myself in a way, who weren't exactly like regular guys or regular guys. We are regular guys in some ways.
Not a bully though.
Yeah, not bullies and kind of anti-bullies. Because I've seen Calvin facing off kind of bullies in an audience, and I've seen Joe doing it as well. And then there's also who is that sissy? His name is Douglas, and he's not quite right. And then there's a kind of chatting about Douglas, he's not quite right. And then I come in and I do my little bit about not being maybe quite right, not being completely normal, but being happy with being that way. And kind of, I guess the song's kind of thesis is, if you're like me, don't listen to those voices, those naysayers. And sometimes people don't have that arrogance of youth thing that I was fortunate enough to have. And it really can cause a lot of damage for people, which can go right through their whole adult life. But yeah, don't listen to those people because, they're the losers, those kind of haters. And I mean, when we joined Creation Records, Alan McGee, one of the reasons Alan McGee signed BMX Bandits was he'd decided he really hated us, but he'd never heard us. He'd never heard us or seen us. And Alan was big enough to kind of say to me, he heard Serious Drugs and then he heard a bunch of other records and then he came to see us live and really, really loved us and went, I had my idea because of the way some of the music press write about you, that you would be this band that I would totally hate. I thought you were going to be some sort of throwaway, slightly arch, annoying comedy act or something. But you've got this music that I love. So he signed us because he wanted to convert the world, to the idea that we weren't like that. But I can't help being the way I am in between songs. It's probably partly a nervousness thing that I'll say things that people giggle at and stuff like that. Because I can't just stand there or I would be, ah! So, yeah, he wanted to go, well, but listen to the records. When I'm gone.
Do you think he was successful in converting the world?
Not in converting the world, but definitely a lot of people. Because up to that point, we pretty much, in the music papers, only had bad press. We had in broadsheet newspapers and in radio shows and broadcasters, we'd had a lot of kind of positive reactions. And with things like the NME and the Sounds back then, it was always kind of bad. And then we released Serious Drugs on Creation, and it was like single of the week and pretty much. Every music paper was hailing it as, a really important record. So that was probably partly because, Alan had turned people's heads around, and we still need to really thank him for that. I remember going to the Creation office and he called everybody that worked in Creation, and by that time that was quite a lot of people, even the people that were working in the warehouse. He called everybody into his office to play him Serious Drugs. And said, I really believe in this track and I really believe in this band, and I want everybody to give it the best they possibly can, And you can't ask for more than that. It ends up not being a hit, partly because the BBC ended up banning it because they were running an anti-drugs week, the week it was going to be released. And it wasn't a pro-drugs record, but...
The mere mention of the word in the title was enough.
Yeah. I mean, it's a provocative title, but Radio 1, we had been told it was going to be Record of the Week in one DJ's show, and it was going to be on the A list, and then be announced for a drugs week, and the news was broken to Creation's pluggers. We can't have a record as a record of the week in some of these shows that's saying get some serious drugs. Funnily enough, Ebenezer Good by the Prodigy, not by Prodigy. Who was it that did Ebenezer Good? Easy Good, Ebenezer Good. Oh man, I forgot the name currently. The Shaman. That was actually saying Ease are good. That got through the loophole, and that was getting played on for Anti-Drug Week. But our record, which wasn't encouraging people to take drugs, that got banned.
There's such a big portion. There's such a large element to all of this that it really comes down to luck. That I think a lot of people don't really discuss. That it's not only just being, obviously you have to be good at what you do, and timing is also important, but there's also just all these external forces that you can't account for when you're going out there.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, I sometimes think maybe I'm the lucky one. Maybe the fact it wasn't a hit, maybe that's actually a better thing happened. Maybe my life would be completely messed up. Maybe I would be, well, I am messed up in some ways, but maybe I'd be messed up in much more serious ways. Because success, for some people, success is the thing that leads to the eventually, checking out of the planet, like way earlier than you would think, or stuff like that. Success isn't always a blessing, or that kind of success. So sometimes, one thing is, I'm allowed to make the records that I want to make. And I don't have to do things like, well, if this one doesn't sell quite as much, we might have to sack the caterers, and we might need to sack like a couple of our merchandise crew, because we don't have those people, So if our records don't sell as much as expected, which isn't that much necessarily, it's only us.
But there are pragmatic and practical concerns, though. I mean, just in terms of actually making a living doing this for as long as you have.
Of course. I mean, that is a struggle. I had a day job at one point when my first son was born. I still was making some music, but I worked for the BBC in radio and then television for 10 years.
What year was that about?
That was from about, well, he was born in 94, but by about 96, I was kind of working at the BBC kind of full time for about 10 years, making like TV shows and radio shows and stuff. And there came a point where I was like, I need to be making more music again. So I kind of turned my back at that point on having that sort of, making sure I could pay my rent and all these sort of things, because it's sort of like having a disease. The thing I can do is make records, and that's sort of what I feel I'm made to do. And I'm not necessarily a money-making machine, And I think, I definitely know people who feel the pressures of, well, if we do something a bit different, or if we really go out there, that's a lot of pressure. We're letting a lot of people down, and also I've now got this lifestyle that is going to be maybe hard to walk away from. I'm currently in a little kind of cupboard underneath the stairs because we don't really have a spare room and things like that. But I'm not unhappy about that. It's fine,
It's a great little studio, honestly.
Yeah, and I can, my jackets are really close by, and the other day I was in doing an interview, and I can't see it right now, but I found my Kermit the Frog tracksuit that I thought I'd misplaced.
I'm sorry, Kermit the Frog tracksuit?
Well, it's actually only the top half. Yeah, it's an Adidas Kermit the Frog. It's not easy being green tracksuit top.
It doesn't actually look like Kermit the Frog.
No, well, it's got a big embroidered Kermit the Frog on the back of it, and it says it's not easy being green. Wait a minute.
I need to see this if you've got that handy. We're not going to be using the video in this interview, but
yeah, this is a good bit for the listeners. This is what radio's made to do. Oh yeah, I found it.
He's in a very small space. Oh wow. Okay, so let's describe this. Okay, so it's. Oh yeah, there you go. So it's extremely green, and it's got a Kermit on the back. And
it has Adidas.
Oh yeah.
And He has embroidered. It's not just like a bad print. It's like he's embroidered there. And the lining.
How did you come into this?
Actually, do you know? Someone bought it as a present, so I don't know where he got it. But I used to have Kermit the Frog Adidas trainers. And yeah, Kermit is like, Jim Henson's as big a guy in my life as pretty much any, pop star or rock star. In fact, more than most pop stars and rock stars. And I think BMX Bandits, the whole thing, Kermit has this kind of ethos almost of like them off as sort of extended family who get together and have crazy adventures and put on shows and things. And I sort of think BMX Bandits is a bit like that, because Norman and Sean Dixon, left BMX Bandits officially years and years ago, but we're still going to pop up,
That's great. Do you think that to an extent, the fact that you haven't been, I guess, confined in a van touring with those two guys for decades has strengthened your relationship?
Possibly. I do wish, like sometimes that Sean and I stayed geographically closer together. We're in terms of America, that might seem ridiculous because, Britain's a pretty small country. But yeah, he lives, in the very south of London, and I live in Scotland. So
listen, I live in Queens, and it is so difficult for me to get to Brooklyn to see people. So I can empathize with that.
Yeah, but it possibly is, but it's also just kind of lovely that they want to spend some of their time occasionally doing stuff, related to the BMX Bandits universe all these years later, because it's almost 40 years since Sean and I formed BMX Bandits, because it was the two of us who started the band back then.
Obviously, there are all, certainly Teenage Fan Club has done well for themselves in terms of sticking around and staying together, but there are so many cases of, I always say, if you want to test a relationship, the strength of a relationship, you move in with somebody. Like, it's a really good way to kind of get to the bottom of if you're compatible with somebody. And I think that being in a band with somebody for an extended period of time and sharing tight spaces is a really good way to test the strength of that relationship.
Well, totally. I mean, we've always been pretty fortunate about it. Possibly because another thing is, unlike some of my more successful in the common use of the sense friends, we haven't been like in tour vans for months and months and end and stuff. I've got a couple of friends who are very successful kind of international DJs based in Scotland called Optimo, and every time they fly, they never sit together. And it's not because they don't like each other. It's actually because they don't want the thing to get worn down. So they always do a thing of, make sure that they give each other their own space, and their relationship's a really good and healthy one.
The equivalent in my world is I know a lot of people who host podcasts with someone else, and they just won't really talk in the meantime so that the conversations are fresh when they get back together.
And I guess a lot of people have an idea that all bands are like the Monkees or something,
The Monkees were definitely not like the Monkees.
No. I share my birthday with two of the Monkees. That could be something for yourself and the listeners to guess which two Monkees did I share my birthday with. There's a clue in one of the album titles.
Okay, this is a good trivia. I'm gonna have to dig into this. I mean, I think the easiest way to figure this out is to determine which two Monkees have the same birthday, and then go from there.
Yeah, two of the two Monkees that have the same birthday are possibly the two that didn't like each other most, which is interesting.
I assume one of them's Mike, because I feel like as much as I love Mike, he may not have been an easy guy to get along with.
Yeah, Mike's one of them. Yeah. Was
it Mike and Mickey?
No. Okay. I think Mike and Mickey did get on quite well.
Oh, they did get on. Okay. Then, would you say that it's the member of the band that was most similar to Mike in terms of musical background?
No.
Okay,
no.
So it's Davey.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I share a birthday with both Mike and Davey. I remember after, funnily enough, Peter Tork, who I guess you were thinking of as the one with the most similar musical background. I remember after he died, I'm not giggling because, he's dead, but I saw an interview with Mike and he was talking about how devastated he was about it. And I was like, oh, that's kind of nice. He's going, I mean, I never talked to him. And at this time we were touring together. And he's going, I mean, I don't think we had, like we spoke more than a sentence, over like the last, 10 years. But, I really loved the guy. And you're like, wow.
Part of me understands that. Part of me understands that, the level of fame that they went through. And I assume that their breakup was not particularly easy. And then also just, it's unfortunately, this is a thing. You're somebody who, by nature of, I think, where you're from and the fact that these people that you knew early on ended up doing something very similar to you have been in touch with people. But, life happens and gets in the way, and you'll suddenly look down and realize you've not talked to somebody in several years. Yeah,
I think it was just I was surprised because we were actively out doing gigs. All that again.
That's fair.
But having said that, when I started working in broadcasting, the first interview I got sent to do was with Ray Davies. And, I was really nervous. I got sent, it was for radio. And I got sent with my little, BBC tape machine.
I assume he's got to be a big hero of yours.
Yeah, very much so. And I spoke to a couple of other people in the building. I'm going to be interviewing Ray Davies. And I go, oh, I've interviewed him. Oh, man. Oh, that's difficult. Oh, that's a nightmare, etc. And I have to say, he could not have been lovelier. For me, it was like, he was so lovely, so considerate, really giving an interview. And, I mean, he, and I thought, I was advised not to mention anything about his brother. And, him and his brother now, I think we've managed to sort all of that stuff out.
Sort of, yeah. But it got real bitter between the two of them.
Yeah, but we're able to be around each other now and things like that. And he said, I love him so much. If I was on stage and, someone threw something at him or whatever, I'd jump to his defence like that, I love him, but I can't talk to him. I can't be in the same room as him unless we're on stage. So that is the thing, and it probably is the love that makes it so, it hurts you so much, or you feel that extreme emotion. If you didn't care that much about a person and they were doing some things that annoyed you, you'd just go, whatever. But when it's blood, I guess it hurts more.
It's interesting that you say that people are telling you he was a difficult interview. I have not, unfortunately, had a chance to interview him. I'm going to say yet, because obviously he's on a very short list for me. But I found in a lot of cases that people that I felt going into it were going to be a difficult interview, whether because of reputation or because I've listened to interviews that they've done. This is going to sound very obvious on the face of it, but if you just ask different questions, and if you ask interesting questions, and if you make it conversational, then you can win a lot of people over pretty. I mean, sometimes it's somebody's just having a bad day, and that's not your fault. Yeah. But for the most part, you can win people over just by engaging them.
Yeah, because I think so many people, when you've got if they're big names and they've got a new album out or doing a new tour, they're getting interviewed by a whole bunch of people who know nothing, and they've just read a Wikipedia article or, a little kind of brief press release for that thing, and they don't know and they don't care about what the person's done. So when you meet, someone like you in the interview context, and you actually know, and they can even just see that you're engaged and you care about things that they've done, they're like, what? Wow.
Your guard is up for the first few minutes of the conversation. Although I will say, and this has only happened to me a few times, but I've actually had a couple of, obviously I won't mention these people by name, but I've had a few instances where the conversation got so deep and so personal and they weren't anticipating it, that they asked me to actually pull the interview because they talked about things they didn't want to talk about.
Yeah, I also can get that. Yeah, you kind of think of things tumble out because you're probably caught out because they're not used to someone actually having that level of being able to kind of empathise, a kind of level of empathy that kind of makes them more comfortable than they possibly want to be.
I mean, you must have had a secret weapon in that standpoint, being a touring musician yourself.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that I really remember was I interviewed James Taylor, and it was down the line. So what is, and we didn't have pictures. It was like this, but it was just audio. And he was really, really cold at the start of the interview. And I mean, it's sort of fair enough. He wasn't being impolite, but he was giving pretty brief, answers. And I'm a big fan of a arranger called Nick DeCaro. He worked on a lot of the classic A&M records, and he was an artist in his own right and stuff. And I knew he'd worked with James Taylor. And because I'm such a big fan of this guy, Nick DeCaro, I knew that he was incredibly well loved by people he worked with. And so I thought, I'm just going to go out on a limb, but also sort of interested. And it wasn't going to necessarily be the sort of thing that the listeners of the show were wanting to hear about, because most of the people listening aren't necessarily going to care about what James Taylor thinks of Nick DeCaro, because they haven't heard of him and don't necessarily know who he is. And I said, I hope you don't mind me asking you, someone I'm a massive fan of is the late Nick DeCaro, and I know you worked with Nick, and I was just wondering, if you had any kind of reflections on it. And that was the point. Everything changed, because he was just like, I love that man so much. He's going, I'm just so happy that guys like you know he existed, and and he was such an incredible, beautiful human being, such a brilliant musician, and he was telling stories like when Nick was leading the orchestra, rather than just conducting, he would be playing his accordion.
In time.
And, so the conducting of the orchestra, and the accordion wouldn't even be mic'd up or anything. It was just a kind of thing, he would be playing it for his own pleasure and enjoying it. And he was going, the other thing, which I loved, because this guy, he'd worked with, a lot of amazing artists and a lot of big names, people like, I think he worked with people like Streisand and Dolly Parton and people like that as well. He wouldn't do sessions, I think it was either Tuesday afternoons or Wednesday afternoons. And no matter how big the name was, he was like, well, I can't do that, because he played his accordion at the local old folks' home every Tuesday afternoon. And that was like, well, yeah, I'm not cancelling that.
An incredibly humanizing thing for someone.
So I think you're right. If you can find that thing, it's just a thing that people haven't asked him about, and a thing that means a lot to him. And that was also good, because it was not in any way about his ego or his achievements. And I think he probably loved that. He was just getting to talk about someone that he loved who was no longer around, and thinking, well, that's good. People don't talk about this guy.
Are you familiar with Nardwuar?
Oh, yeah.
Because to me, he is the best at that, at just catching people completely off guard. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why he's so loved.
I sort of think if he'd happened, if he'd kind of started out 20 years later, I think he would have been a massive social media millionaire. Possibly that wouldn't have been for the better, but it's just almost like he was made for the wrong time. But in a way, maybe it was better he did appear when that stuff wasn't quite as crazy. My
personal estimation of somebody drops significantly if they're mean to Nardwuar.
Oh, yeah.
For example, and this was, they were like kids at the time and whatever, but like Blur was kind of mean to him. And I'm like, I love Blur as a band, but being mean to Nardwuar, you drop a couple of notches for me.
Yeah, there's lots of stories about being kind of arsey people, and I'm not going to... but they're older now. The arrogance of youth can be a funny thing. It can affect people in different ways. I'm not saying they're bad guys, or I don't...
They were young and they were huge, too, and those two things don't always go together well.
And you get some people who that happens to, and they just remain lovely. I mean, I remember, again, one of the... I was running the interview tent for a kind of big festival that used to happen here called Tea in the Park. It was like the big festival in Scotland. And I was running the interview tent for the BBC, and I had to go and pick up Gwen Stefani to do an interview. And, she was really just immediately chatty. And there was a kid who was hanging about backstage who was, had some sort of clear kind of learning difficulties kind of stuff going on. And he'd like a kind of karate badge, on his jacket. And, people are kind of asking her to sign things. And she's signing things and then, but when he came up, it was like so much love and attention. Really good-hearted. She was like doing karate moves with him and all this sort of stuff, and encouraging. And you could tell, like when we ended up being something like 10 or 15 minutes late to get to the interview tent because she was giving them so much, and I wasn't the guy who was going to be saying. I was just kind of going, but it's worth it because the kind of amount of joy that she was bringing them by just engaging in it being really, really warm.
It's similar to the accordion story, which is, and as somebody who has been through the ringer in the music business, I think when you meet genuine people, it's a nice change from music industry people.
Yeah, I mean, I've been fortunate. Most of the people, even people I've admired when I met them, have been pretty nice. And I have met some kind of awful people.
I assume Gwen Stefani has met a lot of awful people, given like how big she got.
Oh, totally. But I met BMX Bandits. This is not the sort of story, but I would be telling you not to put out. This is not the sort of story I normally tell when I'm being interviewed. But BMX Bandits, the first ever tour that Oasis did was with BMX Bandits, opening for BMX Bandits. And
talk about people who have. We'll talk about brothers who don't get along and people who might not be necessarily the coolest to other people.
And I bumped into both of the brothers for the first time in something like 10 years after that, within a week of each other. One of them was up with his girlfriend at that time, and she was taking part in a TV show I was working behind the scenes on. And that was Liam. And man, Liam could not have been nicer. He was so warm, so friendly to me. It was also really nice to all the kids in the audience, because kids were shouting kind of cheeky things at him and kind of funny things, and he was just being so charming. And, he was saying to the other people working the show, yeah, me and the big man, we go way back, and all that sort of stuff. And I know people live near where Liam would live, and he's got a sort of persona in the media, but, he'd be the guy, he would be out, like, he'd give the ice cream van like a whole bunch of cash and say it's a nice day, give the kids free ice creams for the next few hours and stuff like that, and I know people that have worked for him and crew and all that, and they just, he's such a kind of sweet heart and all that. And then I met Liam, not Liam, sorry, I met Noel at Tea in the Park when I was doing the interview tent. I think it was the same year as Gwen Stefani, and I kind of went up and I was like, walking him over to the tent, I was going, I don't know if you remember me. And he's like, yeah, I remember you. I remember you throwing me out your effing dressing room for smoking. And then he wouldn't talk to me for the rest of the time.
Is that a true story? Did you throw him out for smoking?
The story is, at that time people could still smoke indoors in Britain, which they can't do anymore. And I've never been a smoker. And it was a quite long tour for us, so I was getting really pretty throaty. And I was really worried about, my throat going. And everybody was just socialising in our dressing room because it was a bigger room. And I was finding it kind of sore in the throat. And so I sort of said, listen, guys, my throat's, a bit of a concern. Would it be okay if, like, people want to smoke, if maybe go into the other dressing room or something like that? Everybody was like, yeah, sound, no problem. Like Liam, Bonehead, all those guys were all like, yeah, it's fine. And I could see that Noel looked annoyed. And he kind of shuffled out. And then I thought, I sort of took some sort of delight in the fact that he's this multi-millionaire, incredibly successful artist. The guy who he left, in the kind of gutter almost, all those years ago, he's still, I'm not saying he is losing sleep.
He's holding on to it.
He's still holding on to, like, something that to be honest, wasn't like me being, I think, unreasonable or diva-ish, and no one else in that group took personally at all. I felt a certain sense of victory. That and he was on a Primal Scream documentary a couple of years after for the BBC, and he brought a BMX Bandits up just to belittle us. And I was just like, boy, I really got him, didn't I?
That's
The other thing that
amazing.
happened in that tour was Francis McDonald, who was in BMX Bandits, was the other main writer at that time, took him aside one night and said, this is very Francis. He took him aside and went, listen, some of your songs are okay. It's going, but, I mean, you need some more interesting chords in here. Okay, let's look at the song Live Forever. And he's going to go, well, you start it with a blah, blah, blah. What about, a blah, blah, blah? There was a chord that Noel had never heard of. And Noel said to Francis, oh, if I use any of your ideas, do I need to give you a writing credit? And Francis is like, I don't want to write. I don't want to write credit in your songs. Don't worry about that.
These songs aren't going anywhere.
And then the fire alarm went off. So we were quite literally saved with the bell. But it always really amused me as well, the fact that if he met Francis after all these years, he probably would be maybe not so friendly either.
As we're talking about this, I'm thinking about how just like such an important part of getting older and maturing is being able to let go of those things.
Oh, totally. I'm not a person that holds grudges, and I think I think I've been so blessed in being that, because I know other people who I think are really good people, but they sometimes find that kind of pretty difficult, and it really poisons you. You're the person that ends up losing out. It's not the person that you have the grudge against. They're probably away not thinking in about you. So, I wasn't thinking, I hadn't been spending lots of nights lying in my bed thinking about, Oasis becoming a much more successful band regarding record sales than BMX Bandits. I was never thinking about it. And if anybody ever mentioned it, I'd kind of go, oh, I'm pleased for them. And I am pleased, I'm pleased for Liam and things, I think he's a nice guy. But it's like the idea that you would hold on to something that tiny, even though you've had all of this amazing success. It's kind of a bit sad.
I think about that with Trump of just like, you got to be the president and you can tell that there are just things somebody slighted him 20 years ago that he's still holding on to.
I know, it's a funny one, but yeah, in my world, we've been successful because we've been allowed to do what we sort of want to do. And if we'd actually sold a whole bunch of more records and made a lot of other people money, maybe we wouldn't have. I'm sure it would have been great and exciting things that would have happened, but for me, the most important thing is we've sort of been allowed to do what we want to do, and the new record's very like that.
If you said jump, I'd say how high. No matter the demand, I'd always try. My best was never good enough.